Good evening and welcome to another episode of Dana Being Dana. I am your host, Dana Michelle, and welcome to the Implicit Bias Show. We are live on Facebook and at IntellectualRadio.com. And guess what, y'all? We are celebrating 80 shows.
Wow.
80 shows today on the radio.
Congratulations.
Fantastic
news, Dana.
This is a dance you do when it's been 80 shows.
I know that's right.
But I appreciate you all. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for following. Thank you so much for joining Dana Being Dana, because we are talking about such a very important topic tonight. I'm very excited. Please share the show, host a watch party, because we want to raise awareness about implicit, unconscious, prevalent, overt bias.
Yes.
We all have biases, and we will be talking about that, or bias. We'll be talking about that tonight, which is great. So I'm so excited for my friends who have joined me tonight, both in person and on the phone. We'll do introductions shortly. But before that, a couple things. I want to talk about the exciting things that are happening on Dana Being Dana. We have an event tomorrow night at 7:30 at 29 Martini Lounge in Naperville. 29 Martini Lounge in Naperville. Please join us for a very special announcement. We are very excited about all the things that are happening with Dana Being Dana. The Naperville mayor, Steve Cherico, and his lovely wife, Julie, will be joining us for this very special announcement. So please come check us out. Again, please share the show. Please host a watch party. We're going to have a great time. Tomorrow night's going to be super fun. Wednesday's a new Friday. I was what I always say, but Thursday may be the new Friday tomorrow night. I want to thank our sponsors, Medhat Seabay from State Farm Insurance. He's awesome. Such a great guy. Please check him out. www.medhat Seabay. medhatsbeih.com, or reach out to him. Tell him Dana Being Dana sent you. 630-800-2743. And my girl Damali, how are you?
I'm fantastic, Dana. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Can you please introduce Damali Law LLC and Breakthrough ADR, as well as introducing yourself?
Absolutely. So Damali Law LLC is a law firm that I founded a couple of years ago. And I don't know, should I look at you or look at
the camera? Look everywhere, honey. Look everywhere. Let them know. Show them.
Look at Greg. Should look at Pam. I don't know who to
Everybody
look at.
looks at me. You're so beautiful. Don't y'all agree?
Damali Law LLC is a law firm that I founded 2 years ago. And essentially, it focuses on corporate transactional work. And so we help individuals, small companies, big companies with their corporate needs. So we do everything from negotiating contracts to forming companies to drafting agreements. So we were kind of a full service stop for your corporate business needs. Breakthrough ADR is a recent initiative that is intended to be a network of conflict resolvers throughout the world. And we focus on conflict resolution, conflict prevention, resolution, and management. And that is something that I think really ties in nicely to the show.
Absolutely. And I am so glad you're here. You came all the way from
New York.
Wu-Tang. That's great. But I appreciate you being here. She is my soror. She is my sister. We went to college together, and just a very, very good friend of mine. Our kids have hung out. It's a beautiful thing. So it's a pleasure doing this adult thing with you. Thank you so much for being here and being a part of this journey and sharing with me. You were the anchor for this show. This idea came from Damali. She was like, let's talk about implicit bias. This was before she knew about the college admission scandal and other topics. And we picked a date, and now we're here. I'm so excited that we're here. Thank you so much for joining me. I'd like to introduce Reverend Pam.
Yes.
Before that, you had talked about joining me on Dana Being Dana.
That's correct.
You said you just wanted to support and show up. And
Absolutely.
I was like, as soon as I get a topic that would be on point, I want you to come.
It worked out perfectly, didn't it?
Absolutely. Because you were a former diversity officer.
Yes.
Where?
At Northwestern and University of Illinois.
At Northwestern, which is fantastic. And so talking about bias, implicit bias and other types of bias, it's great that you're here.
Thank you for having me.
So Reverend Pam came from my old church where I grew up, St. Paul A&E.
Yes.
I'm so glad you're here. Shouts out to the St. Paul family. Can you talk a little bit about yourself?
Yes, absolutely. I am clergy, as you mentioned, and in the United Methodist Church, and we're proud and faithful and excited about that. But in my current role, I am the Director of Leadership and Accountability for the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women. So our role is to challenge the church for the full inclusion of women.
Well,
and so when we talk about inclusion and bias, we're all over it.
Hello.
All over it.
Amen.
And this is exciting for me to be here.
Pass the collection plate. We're going to take up a donation right now.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Yes.
The brother in the room, besides you, Earl. Thank you, Earl. I'm so glad to be back in the studio with Earl. But the other brother in the room, Greg, how you doing?
How you doing?
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I was attending a panel discussion over Martin Luther King. And that's when I first encountered Mr. Greg. And he blew me away with just not only his insight, but his resume. And if you look him up on Facebook, it's real long. But notably, he has been the Chief Diversity Officer, the first of the Democratic National Committee. So he's a big cheese, and I'm so excited that you've joined me. Can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, let me first of all, again, thank you for allowing me to participate on this panel. I'm excited about the time that we're going to spend discussing this topic. I, after spending 30 years in corporate America at places like Amtrak, R.R. Donnelley's, Abbott Laboratories, U.S. Cellular, I ventured into politics by assuming the role as the first Chief Diversity Officer of the DNC. And I was there during the last administration, not to be confused. I am not involved with 45 and whatever you may think about the Democratic Party in terms of its current positioning. But I went out on my own, like so many people after politics. So I now consult. I head up a group of advisors. We advise corporations and organizations in various topics, from business development to cultural assessments to diversity and inclusion, conflict resolution, leadership. So we have about 5 or 6 streams of income, hopefully income.
All right.
Cases. And we do a lot of public speaking, and we do a lot of training. And I'm so glad to represent the group that I founded tonight.
And the men in general. So I appreciate you being here.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Okay.
On the phone, we have 3 of my favorite ladies as well joining us. Anthony, how are you, girl?
I am amazing. How are you, Dana?
I am good. Anthony, again, also is my Spelman sister and my soror, and it's her birthday today.
Happy
So
birthday.
happy birthday, girl.
Happy birthday.
Happy
Thank
birthday.
you.
Happy birthday. So I appreciate you taking time out of your evening and in your celebration to join us, because you too are a diversity officer, correct?
I am.
Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah. So currently, I manage diversity and inclusion for the largest utility corporation in the United States. And really excited because in my day-to-day work, I help people navigate through bias, advocate for change, and then make sure that people of color specifically are able to thrive and grow in spaces traditionally kept from us. I also have a side business called the Career Design Lab, where I specifically help coach women and people of color through these challenges, because mediocre Matt is out there and he is coming for you and he does not care.
Mediocre Matt.
About your life.
Who is that?
Mediocre Matt. Mediocre Matt is every white male in America.
Oh, snap. Mediocre
That
Matt,
was
if you're
yours.
watching, please share the show. Be mediocre and host a watch party. That'd be amazing. Next is my girl, Venu. How are you?
I am great, Dana. Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us. Venu and I met initially when I was applying to be a law student at Northwestern. So she did my interview. They require interviews at Northwestern for law school. And that's how we first connected. The beauty of life is that people will always come back into your life if they're meant to be.
Mm-hmm.
And Venu and I reconnected when she was the executive director of the Chicago Committee. And it's just been so nice staying in touch. We've never fell out of touch since then. And she's been one of my early supporters of Dana Being Dana. And 80 shows later, she's on the show. And I appreciate you joining us, Venu. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself that I haven't said already?
Yeah, sure. It's true. I did try to convince you to come to Northwestern, and you said no. How persuasive I am. I was the director of diversity at Northwestern Law School, which is how Dana we met.
Yep.
And then I went on to head something called the Chicago Committee on Minorities in Large Law Firms, the goal of which was to increase the number of people of color in law firms, which is no easy job for those of you that know law firms. And, you know, in every other institution since then, sort of making sure that women and people of color and women of color especially have a voice and have some space to speak their truth.
Thank you so much for being here. And last but not least, my girl, Corey, how are you?
I am well, and I am so excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much. You're calling in from California.
I am.
Yes, and I appreciate you. Corey has had a challenging job because she is in the profession of diversity in the law firm space. And the profession of law has an abysmal record when it comes to diversity, representation, and numbers, and just progression. I think well-intentioned at times, obviously, but I also think some of the progression has been slow, I think for several reasons. But Corey, can you please introduce yourself? Thank you so much for being here.
Sure. My name is Corey Peru. I am an inclusion and belonging strategist. I am also an advocate, a lawyer, a coach, a speaker, and a truth teller. And I always add that truth teller space, that title there, so that people know that if they ask me to help them with their diversity and inclusion, it will come with a hefty serving of truth. I help organizations develop organizational strategies to increase diversity, to create inclusion and belonging. I work with individuals, mentor, coach, tutor, counsel, hand out tissue, offer a shoulder, all of that. And I've done that in law firms for several years now. I was a practicing lawyer before that, a trial attorney. But over the last 25 years of my life, I have provided education and opportunities to equip and empower people to do better. I see my life calling in this stage of my life as helping individuals and communities, organizations build bridges across differences, equipping and empowering women and minorities to succeed at challenges, and to provide a voice and advocacy for those marginalized groups who've been muted. So that's what my work is, whether it's in a law firm, in my community, bar associations, or even in my church. And I most recently gave a TEDx on the subject of belonging and racial justice, how to interrupt bias and stand up to racism. And it's called Just Belonging, Finding the Courage to Interrupt Bias. So
it is so your calling. Corey, it is so your calling, because we connected because she blew me away at a conference and she just spoke about so many different topics, but just about belonging and just being a woman and just, I mean, she's awesome. She's absolutely fantastic. And I appreciate you, Corey, for being here. I want to start with you with just the definition for everybody who's tuning in. Please share the show. Can you talk about what is implicit bias?
Right. So implicit bias refers to the part of our thinking that is just below the consciousness, right? That has to do with association, beliefs, attitudes that we may have towards any particular group. When we talk about bias, we're talking about a preference for or against a particular group. But implicit bias is not conscious. It's implicit, it's underlying. And three things that I would say that absolutely need to be said up front, because when we start talking about implicit bias, a lot of people get very defensive. First of all, it's below the consciousness. Second of all, it can be contrary to what you say or express views are. So you can actually be an advocate for diversity and inclusion and for treating people with equity and dignity and still have implicit bias. And because we're all subjected to the same environment where we're receiving the same messages and stereotypes, we're all impacted by them. And the third thing, I guess I already said, we all have them. Our brains are wired to box information and schemas in ways that we can process things easily. And it allows us to make shortcuts, to make quick decisions. And when we're under stress and when we are emotional, that's when we're most likely to make decisions based on our implicit bias. So that's just a brief definition, description of what implicit bias is.
Does anybody want to add to that?
I'll add to that. Corey, I think, one, thank you for that definition. It was fantastic and very thorough. And I agree with a lot of what you said. I wanted to highlight the last thing that you said, which was when we're under stress and in conflict, that's when we kind of revert back to that implicit bias. And I think that's really key, especially with my background and my expertise, which is in conflict resolution, management, and prevention. When people are under stress, when you are in conflict, that is when you kind of revert back to that fight, flight, or freeze version of yourself.
That's
Your
right.
Primal.
the primal. I think it's called something like, it's that amygdala part of your brain that's what actually we share with reptiles. And so when you go back to that part of you, your ability to utilize your executive function has been suspended. And so you do revert to things that are under that consciousness level of, well, what is my mind telling me? What did my environment teach me? How do I view this scenario? And that's how, we typically react to a situation when we're in conflict.
And I would add that we are bombarded with millions of thoughts and things coming at us every day, all kinds of information, and our brains can only process about 2% of them. And so as a result of receiving so much information and trying to process so much, we always have this innate ability that just says, this is what I do, this is what I think. And I think that speaks to what you're saying, that it's because we have these latent behaviors that are just going to express themselves and unearth themselves because we can't process everything in the moment. There's just too much information out there.
2%.
I want to add too that, if you have a brain, you're biased. There's no, it doesn't, it's the truth. It doesn't affect one race or one class of people any different than another. It's just how you come to situations and how you have evaluated things and how you're taught and raised and how you are taught to protect yourself. So if you have a brain, you're biased.
And it could be as simple as a preference for ice cream, right? You could be presented with chocolate and vanilla and you just have a preference for one over the other. So it's not about, it doesn't always have to have implications or negative connotations to it.
Correct.
That's right.
It could just be, preferences or what you've been influenced by. Somebody could be telling you all along, chocolate is the best. Chocolate's good for you. You can never survive without chocolate, blah, 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 blah. Where you prefer vanilla, right? So you don't know, but it's so it's about your influences and what has influenced you. Can we talk about some of the things that we form opinions about? What are some of the things that we form opinions about? And we've talked on some of them.
Well, when we think in terms of from a diversity perspective, all Black people do certain things. They all like greens and cornbread.
And chitterlings.
And chitterlings, yes. Or we might assume that a certain person of a certain race or ethnicity does certain things a certain way. And those become part of the stereotypes that can play into implicit bias.
Absolutely. So there's a list, gender, income, parental status.
Mm-hmm.
Are you a parent? Aren't you a parent? Marital status, divorced, single, widowed. Age, physical abilities, appearance, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, family, culture, education, upbringing, religion. I think it was Anthony who said before some of the ways in which we acquire biases. How do we acquire them? What are the influences that help create some of the biases that people carry?
Well, this is Anthony, and it's really how you're raised. It's fight or flight. You're taught to, as women, clutch your purse because the man is coming behind you. And you've just been taught that your whole life. That doesn't mean it was right or wrong. It's influences, it's experiences that you had. You touched the hot stove, so now you know the stove is hot. It didn't mean that you shouldn't touch it. It didn't mean that you should you should, have certain rules around touching a stove. It's just how you approach the situation, what's been embedded in your mind, and then how you then approach the situation, having learned those rules or paradigms in your past, whether they're right or wrong. It's just how you come to the situation. And it could be it's how you even show up at work. It's how you pick people to serve on teams. It's how you pick people to, be the best and brightest in programs. It's just, and it could be that you've come to without information.
It could be teams like dodgeball in third grade.
Yeah.
Or a team at work.
Yes.
To deal with a sensitive investigative matter, or whatever it is that you come with. What I thought was interesting about what you said, and we've touched on this, is about how you were raised or kind of what you were born into.
Socialization. And
what I think is important also is not just what you're born into, but how you're raising your own children.
Yes.
So you can tell how some of the biases are passed generationally.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a big issue. I think also I would like to add that it's also the environment in which you exist or have exist or can exist. It can be going from high school to college. Now you're in a whole independent setup, and now the environment can force you to have certain biases. So I understand preferences. I understand prejudice. I also understand bias. And when I hear implicit bias, it can be as small or as large as your orientation. So if someone says, for example, and I'll make this real quick, that I heard a politician say, he said, she's Hispanic, but she's smart.
Wow.
And that's the difference between, so I had to correct him on but versus and. So it can be very simplistic. He could have said she's Hispanic and she's smart. His orientation, he felt comfortable saying but, which is however.
Right.
And that put
in spite of.
Right. Exactly. So that put a connotation of a implied bias based on what he's used to saying. And he didn't see any offense to it.
Just and that's the problem, is that people don't even recognize or see or understand where it all comes from.
Yeah.
Until today.
I also think, right, we take so many actions subconsciously, and many of you have said this, but I think what also happens is we take those actions and then we attach meaning to them or justify them without realizing it, right? So we'll do something that demonstrates bias, and then attach some reasoning after the fact about why what we did was the right thing, right? So if you're, for example, crossing, let's say you're walking down the street and you see someone coming the other way and you say, okay, I'm afraid of that person and I'm going to cross the street. And you'll say, okay, I was afraid, so I should have crossed the street, as opposed to saying, should I have been afraid? Is that really legitimate?
Yeah. So what you're really talking about is.
Let me. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I was going to jump in real quick there. But finish your thought.
Oh, I was just going to say. So what you're really speaking to is the need for us to slow down and take inventory of how we think and process information that we're seeing or experiencing.
Absolutely. Corey?
Yeah. Yeah, what I was going to say is, some of what we're talking about, it's not just the home bringing, it is also society. You can teach your kids certain things, but our community, our culture, and our history and our legacy is constantly sending messages, whether it's the radio, whether it's music video, whether it's television, whether it's things that teachers say. I grew up in Nigeria. I can tell you the day that I had the highest score on my test, my teacher made a comment to the class. He congratulated me and he told the boys, you should be ashamed of yourself that the girls beat you. Okay? So these messages come from all kinds of places. The day that my daughter saw a video and it was all Black people, and she said to me, wow, Mom, they're all brown. And I said, so what do you think about that? And she said, well, it's always all peach people. And maybe if they have a
peach
brown
people.
person, there's only
Shout
one.
out to the peach people.
Notice the message, because these messages are basically they're giving you messages and they're coming at all times. So even in the home, we have to be very proactive. Mm-hmm. But, one of you was just talking about how we convince ourselves of what our bias already is. So we already have the bias and then we try to justify it. And I think part of the issue is that we are actually emotional beings who have the ability to be rational. And we like to convince ourselves that it's the other way around. And the way cognitive biases work is we look for confirmation of what we already believe. So we'll remove all the information that doesn't jive with what we already believe, and we'll hone in on evidence that supports what we believe. And you're right. You're exactly right. We don't really stop and think, wow, why did I cross the street when I saw that man? And was that bias, or did I actually have any basis for that?
And that's because we create these mental shortcuts to respond to all this information that's coming into our minds all day long. And you can't possibly process every single thing you think and do in the moment. So you have the fight or flight syndrome. You have that mindset to do what you've been taught or what you've been conditioned to do. But it's a mental shortcut that gets you from point A to point B that you can do without having to really think about it or process the thought behind the behavior.
And I think what you said earlier was a great point about how people don't think and often jump to conclusions. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about, Cora mentioned confirmation bias. There's other types of biases that I'd like to bring up. You can think of some as well if you want to jump in. Confirmation is when you look for info that supports your belief while rejecting any type of data that comes against that. Anchoring bias is when you jump to conclusions based on information that you obtain early in your process, even if it proves to be inaccurate later on. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times people get pride and ego sometimes can get you stuck on your opinion.
Yeah.
Even when you've got evidence that suggests that you're wrong about what you originally or initially thought.
Yes.
People want to hold on. Availability bias sometimes is about relying on information that's readily available. So just because it's prevalent, which is why media does this all the time. They will oversaturate with bias because they make it available and therefore people believe that it's true.
And everybody thinks that it's true.
Exactly, because it's available.
Yeah.
This, overconfidence. I've heard this is often associated with entrepreneurs. When I found this in my research, overconfidence, when you place too much faith in your knowledge, opinions, or contribution, where it's like, this happened because of me, right? Versus just a coincidence or several things coming together in the right moment, not necessarily because it was all about you. What other type of biases are there or examples that you want to share to kind of shed light on how prevalent bias can be?
Well, I had a boss that, it was a primarily white organization.
You mean peach people? That's going to be the thing.
I need to write that down.
And, a very well-intentioned, kind man in lots of ways. But anytime we would talk, maybe not anytime, but he really wanted to talk to me about India. He really, I talk to this man all the time. And even still, the lens in which he wanted to connect to me outside of work was what Indian restaurants, what Indian history. I don't read about Indian history. I don't have time for that.
He's just trying to eat, love, and pray.
Oh my God.
He read the book, basically.
So that bias of the bias is that the only way that he can connect to me interpersonally is about India or something Indian. Whereas, I go to the movies like everybody else. I read lots of different kinds of books like everybody else. So, even when it's well-intentioned, and maybe especially when it's well-intentioned, that bias shows up.
Absolutely.
And then I want to toss in one on similarity bias. Similarity bias, shows up when you pick people. It's most like the example that was given earlier about the Hispanic example. Like she's a good Latina. Perceiving people who are similar to you. And that makes it okay. So with in-group bias, these people are like me, so it's cool. I'll never forget, I went, because I'm a lawyer too, I went to interview at a firm, and the first thing out of the hiring manager's mouth was, "Oh my God, you Spellman, we love you guys from there." Well, you guys from where? And so he was trying to make like that similarity bias, that this was a little good school that I could connect to because it was like me. And that made it make sense because then I was in group. I was one of the crew. I could fit in because I was in group and I wasn't like everyone else, which was bad and would not fit into that firm or into that group.
That reminds me, I'm just looking through some of my notes from a presentation of primacy bias. I don't know if I heard you talk about that.
What's primacy bias?
Where we sort of we certain balance or weight to some experiences or certain kinds of people that we don't give to others, and we deem those as higher than others and better than others because they've had certain experiences. So
can you give us an example?
Yeah, I have one here. It says that we believe the CEO is more intelligent than everyone else in the room.
Right. Yeah. Right. And he could just be the most slick or clever.
Absolutely.
To get the job.
Absolutely.
But not necessarily the smartest person in the room.
That's right.
Why is there such a stigma or guilt associated with bias or having bias? Because a lot of times, if you're like, you're so biased, people get very offended and defensive. Why do you think that is?
This is Corey. I think that part of the issue, frankly, is that in America, we like to think of ourselves as people who are so committed to meritocracy that we have it down. We like to prize objectivity and rationality, evidence, study above everything else. We glorify the rational over the emotional, the gut, the instinct. And so the idea that we could be making decisions based on something that we don't control doesn't even jive culturally. Because I think there's other cultures across the world that the conversations they have about bias are different. And they're kind of open about it. Yeah, we kind of have a bias against X, Y, Z, and we're okay with it. And you really have to convince them that it's wrong to have that kind of bias.
And I think
so I think some of it is cultural.
I agree, and I think there's a defensiveness as being thought of as ist, racist, sexist, ageist. Yeah. Like, oh my gosh, that's. I cross the street when peach people walk by. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry. Whoever said peach people, I just thought it was hilarious. I've never heard that before. But I think that defensiveness, and I just want to kind of remove some of that stigma. So I'm going to ask you guys, and they don't know this. Let's talk about our own biases and some of the biases that we carry. What bias do you find that you carry the most? And I'll go first to give you a chance to think. Put myself out there, and I think this came from law school, because being trained as a lawyer, you are trained to find evidence for your conclusions. So I would say probably the bias that I carry the most is confirmation bias, because I'm always proving my case. People who argue with me know she's always trying to prove her point.
But you've always been like that, Dana.
See, we're going to go to commercial. We're going to take a break.
Prior to law school,
I've known her for about 22 years, and I can testify.
The confirmation bias, and I think that's true. So I try to be open to other, and it's a work in progress, right? And I want people to know, and that's why we're being transparent about some of our biases. Notice I said we're gonna start with you, Reverend Pam. Next, no, but talking about our different biases, because we all have them. And so I want everybody to understand I have some confirmation bias issues, and I'm working on that, but we all do. And so
I could say, to be honest, and this would be a transparent moment, that I do sometimes put people in stereotype bias.
Yeah.
I make assumptions that certain people of a certain age are going to behave a certain way or think a certain way, whether that be your millennials or your
entitlement.
Yeah, well, exactly. So I think even though I know and I try to process my
no
thoughts,
millennial talk.
We have a breakup on the phone.
so I would admit that there have been times where I made assumptions based on stereotypes
Yeah.
that I might have that have no bearing on the persons that's standing right in front of me.
And that could be, I mean, as a diversity officer of Northwestern,
You do that.
you're encountering millennials all the time.
all the time. Not just millennials, older people.
Older people.
You know.
And you get people, and this is the confirmation bias, right? When you get people, or the availability bias, right?
Mhm.
If you've got preconceived notions or biases about millennials, for example, and you're on a college campus, well, there you go.
Yep.
You know, and they're like,
And
well,
you do see it all the
you
time.
see it all the
so,
time.
Yeah.
You see it all the time. What else? What other biases are percolating through Dana B and Dana through our guests?
I mean, I think
This is
for me is which bias don't I have?
Oh, exactly.
Good point.
I mean, I have all of them. I think I'm particularly susceptible to the availability bias, but and all I can hope for is that on some good days I recognize them and can separate what I aspire to be from the thoughts that are sort of running in my head on automatic pilot.
And this is Anthony. I think mine is safety bias. I mean, it just is. I think my parents trained me to be on the lookout for the man who's going to jump out and get you out of every
That's because
corner.
Anthony's so fine. She's so beautiful.
Right.
Don't you agree?
Absolutely. Everybody wants some of this stuff.
Hey, hello, even the peach people.
So, you know, so I do have that fear irrationally at times. Like it just comes out and you don't even realize. And you're like, that was just really inappropriate for no reason.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
Well, I have opinions, I have prejudice, and I have bias about so many things. Young people, old people, tall people, short people. I can find something idiotic about most people. And I guess what I've sought to do as I've matured is to look inward to see how I can be more open to that. I'm biased against people who live in the suburbs, who look down on people in the city. I look down on people in the city that we know they can't drive, but people in the city that have a problem with suburbanites, thinking that they're the upper crust of situations. So I try to, when I lived in the suburbs, I found myself trying to calibrate how suburbanite I would be. And when I moved back into the city recently, you know, I had to calibrate how much of a urban guy I was going to be. Do I speak to everybody? Do I speak to everybody that speaks to me? Do I get mad at people that say, why do I know you and you spoke to me? So I think somebody said earlier, if you're human, you have bias. I have bias, I have prejudice, I have opinions, strong opinions.
You choose vanilla or chocolate ice cream?
I will not eat chocolate, and I don't care who invite me to do it. And if that's all you have, that's it. I won't eat that, but I'll eat black walnut, but a pecan, I'll eat strawberry.
Chocolate suburbanite.
Yeah, see? Okay. Thank you.
So it's probably appropriate that I chime in, I guess, last about this, because as a mediator, as a neutral, I have biases, but I've been trained for almost 20 years to suspend biases so that I am appearing neutral, both in appearance and in fact. And what that allows me to do is to help people reach an understanding and an agreement, because it's their process that I'm facilitating and I'm not biased. And one of the things that I was talking about earlier with Greg was that sometimes you have to check in with yourself and say, am I being biased? And the way that I think this conversation has been going with the amazing panelists, and to piggyback on what Dana said before, that people get defensive when they're confronted with being biased, that's because communication goes two ways. There's output and there's input. And when you're talking about bias, usually the orientation of the conversation is about what people are saying, not how you receive the information.
Say that again.
Because I think a lot of bias is all the same amount of bias is in how you receive information. Because you may think someone's crossing the street because they have a bias against you walking down the street, but that might be because of bias that you have about certain actions that people make.
That's true.
And so I really think if
they
we
could have just been turning on 3rd Street.
I mean, even me coming here today.
Going to get chocolate ice cream.
Going to get ice cream. Even me coming here today, like I crossed the street because I was looking at my phone to figure out how to go where I was going, and not because there was someone on the corner, but perhaps that person thought that, and that's how they receive the information.
Because people project.
Yes.
One thing I've learned in this grown folks' life is people project everything, their issues, their insecurities, their thoughts, their own biases.
Yes. And can I add this too, Dana?
Add it, girl, because you're a sponsor.
I think the dialogue about bias should also include intent versus impact.
Absolutely.
Because once we start thinking about that, I think we can have a more open conversation. I think that hopefully that means that the work that we're doing with diversity and inclusion and other initiatives to make people feel more a part of as opposed to other is based on that. If you intended to do something because of a bias, a prejudice, and a stereotype, then maybe you should check yourself. If you intended to do something different, for example, I love India. I've been there twice. If I if I met you, Venu, I would want to talk to you about India. I don't consider that to be a bias. It's just one of my favorite countries. I wrote that today in an email. It's one of my favorite countries. And so I think that in my mind, my intent is to connect with you who appears to be a visual representation of India, but the impact to you as you receive the information may be like, really? Like, is that what we're going to talk about right now because I'm Indian? And so I think that we have to add that to the discussion.
And I think we have to be accountable and take responsibility for the impact. In other words, it takes two for an impact: the intent and the reception, how it's received. And so you could say, I didn't mean for that to have the impact that it did. And there's a check in the biases. One thing I want to say about you all, and I'm so glad you guys are here. Thank you so much already for joining me in this discussion, because I think it's great. I love, because I surprised y'all with that.
Yes, you did.
They're all panelists and esteemed individuals. So they asked me several times, like, tell us the questions, tell us what you're going to ask. But I told them that's just not how we roll. But what I love about it is I appreciate you guys sharing your biases, but I think that was important to demonstrate, because you guys are in positions where you have been trained and you operate despite having bias. And that's what people seem to get defensive about, is that I shouldn't have any bias. I have no bias. Everybody has bias. Yeah. That's what I want people to walk away with. Everybody has bias, but it's about checking bias.
Yeah,
that's right.
Addressing bias, understanding, taking a moment to reflect, to say, is this my bias talking, or is this some sort of reality? Is this rooted in true
where
fact?
Did I get that idea?
Exactly.
Where did that thought come from? Where did I learn that behavior? Sometimes just asking yourself those questions.
Right.
And then also being open to receive that kind of feedback.
The feedback, being open.
I remember when I got my first 360 from my staff, and the staff wrote down, you're biased because you speak to the same people first when you walk into the office. And I said to myself, I spoke to the same people first. So what did that mean? And they were very serious about giving me that feedback. So instead of coming through the door that I saw the same people first, because I thought I only spoke to them.
This is the desk by the door.
I came the other way so I could speak to the other people first, not sarcastically, but meaning to receive that feedback because it meant something to them, even though it didn't mean anything to me. Right. I learned to understand that people rarely see you the way you are.
What type
they see you the way they see you, and you must be open to accept
what that perception is.
That's right.
What that perception is. Right. What bias has impacted you most? What bias has impacted you most? I will say, on a professional front, for me, it's been racial, because of the type of profession that I have as an attorney, the law school that I went to, people didn't assume, because I tend to be very unassuming. Like, I don't dress like a lawyer is supposed to dress, right? I am in a family reunion t-shirt and my yoga pants all day. That's my uniform because I work from home. So people don't assume, that I'm an attorney or the type of law school that I went to. And so for me in education, it's been racial. And I think socially, a lot of times it's gender, because I think gender bias pits women against each other.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the things that I go against when it comes to Dana Being Dana. Like, my show is about women supporting women. I've had a ton of female sponsors. I uplift women. No shade, Greg.
That's all right. I support women.
But I love truly supporting and loving women in tangible, meaningful ways. Not just like, girl, you're so cute. I love your coat. You're so pretty. But like, how can I help you? How can I lift you up? How can I introduce you to people? What can I do to help leverage you and your platform? And I think it's the gender bias of competing that pits women against each other. So the question to you, that was your lead time to think of your answer. What bias has impacted you most?
I would say, if I can chime in, early on in my career, race was the number one bias. I can recall being in a situation where someone walked in and said, I need to speak to the manager. Can you direct me?
And it's you.
Right. And I say, well, I think they want to talk to you, which was my white assistant. And they said, are you the manager? No, he's the manager. And then the look on the face was like, okay, all right, I guess I got to bite that one. Later in life, it really has been an age piece, but it really has been my having to adjust to the different generations in the workplace and how they see things and how they evaluate things. So I've had to be able to look past the baby boomer piece to understand how other generations interpret what they're experiencing. The single employee that feels as though they have a special weight against the married employees because of benefits. We're paying for them and their family. So we're being put upon. So you have to so that's what I've seen. Early on, race, later on, age.
What else?
And this is Anthony. I'm going to jump in on the age thing. So I am a millennial, and the challenge that I always hear is millennial this, millennial that. My melanin is popping, and I look a lot younger than I am. Always have. And so it's the misjudgment and stereotypical bias of 1, you're a Black female, 2, you look like you're 12, and 3, oh, you must be a millennial, you can't focus, you do these things, et cetera, X, Y, Z. And so when statistically and under actual research, millennials are no different than boomers when coming into the workforce at the time they entered the workforce. Millennials want nothing different. They want feedback. They want the ability to have some flexibility. They want to be able to take care of their families. They like paychecks just like boomers do. It is the notion that you've moved away from your age group and your demographics, and you've gotten a little bit under your belt, but the things you wanted and how you approach work at that point in time in your life is the same. And we often get away from that. So you put that stereotypical lens on something from your vantage point of years and experience or years into a field, and you forget where you came from. And that then causes that level of a bias, which is frustrating to me and my millennial people who may be watching, because we are no different than people who are in the workforce right now. I'm actually an exennial. That's an extra layer for y'all, and X with a little bit of millennial on the edge. So to me, that's that's mine.
I'll jump in with mine because it's something that I've experienced probably for the last, it's a new bias that I've experienced. And I'm just going to make this up. Maybe you in the diversity and inclusion space have a name for this, but I'm going to call it spouse bias. And what I mean by that is I am an attorney. I have my own company. I happen to be married to a brilliant attorney as well. And what I get a lot is the assumption that because I have a husband who does X, that means Y for me. And especially even a few weeks ago, I got a call to my office, and it was a vendor calling from a company that I have used. And when I happened to be there, so I answered the phone, and he said, "May I speak to Mr. Peterman?" And I said, "On this number?" Because it was in my office. And I said, who are you calling for? Why are you calling? Where are you calling from? And he said, "Oh, from this company. And I wanted to speak to the CEO." And I said, "Well, I'm the CEO." And he said, "Oh, and I said, does it say, what does it say there? Like, what in your record? Because I've bought several services from you. So why would you say Mr. Peterman?" I've also had many people say male, female, older, younger, across the board. "Oh, you can have your own companies because your husband does X." And, I don't want to be defensive about it. He's super supportive. He's amazing. But I work very hard.
Right.
I work very hard, and I work more than I sleep and do anything else.
Right.
And so I don't know what that bias is called, but it's something that I feel like I've experienced since I've been married. Whereas before, I mean, I'm sure there were other biases that came to mind, but this one has been consistent throughout my time being married.
Well said.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Some people believe that there's no such thing as bias. Do you agree with that statement? In other words, people talk about there's no unconscious bias. Like, everybody's woke, everybody's conscious. They know what they're saying. They know what they're doing. Do you agree with that?
I do not.
I
don't think that that some people don't have bias. I think everyone does. And I think the persons who don't believe they have a bias are the ones who are most in danger of enacting that bias against others.
Well said. On the phone?
So I think there are two things going on when people say that, and some of it, the emphasis is valid. Implicit bias is real. It's true. But like a friend of mine taught me when I was fairly new to this country, people know water is wet, right? She used to say that to me all the time when I would explain things away. There are some things that get attributed to implicit bias that are outright explicit. And I think that's where some of the frustration comes from, because some people feel as if by placing so much emphasis on implicit bias, we're giving people a pass. And I don't think that's true enough at all. I don't think it's true. I just think we have to have these conversations in nuanced ways where we acknowledge which parts of things are implicit, which parts are explicit, which part is prejudice, which part is outright bigotry, and also having very honest conversations about things like sexism or racism or any of the other isms that tie into this whole thing. So that's how I assess that situation. I think there's a lot of frustration where people feel like some things are being hidden behind implicit bias when it's actually explicit.
I'll chime in, Stamala.
I would say that I may fall into the camp that's frustrated by the use of implicit bias so broadly. I think because we've had to dance around the race conversation for so long, not to mention every other conversation where people don't have the voice or power that they should, that right now the concept of implicit bias allows us sometimes to make white people primarily feel okay about discussing these things, because in truth, right, even with implicit bias, the outcomes are terrible for people of color, for women, for LGBTQ folks. So the fact that it's implicit doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay to stay.
Right. So experts,
That's an excellent
how do we change bias? How do we impact bias? How do we bring about us getting closer to a better place with respect to bias?
I love that question, Dana. Mm-hmm. The word bias is a deeply charged emotional word. And I think that the reaction people have to it is usually to either say, I don't have bias, or to like vehemently say, that wasn't bias, I meant X. And I think that if you change the conversation around bias, I've done this with the word conflict, right? If you lead and say who has a conflict, no one will raise their hand. But if you define what a conflict is. Oh, it's just a disagreement or a difference of opinion or, an issue. That's it. Everyone will raise their hands. I think you can do the same thing with bias. You can say what bias is. Corey started this session off by defining bias. I've been in different situations for diversity and inclusion where they've just asked you, take a step forward if X, take a step backwards if Y. Everyone did the activities. Everyone was super excited about it. And then at the end, the moderator said, so these are different biases that you have.
Right.
And some people were floored that, oh my gosh, I have a bias.
And I talked to a friend of mine who, as we were doing the marketing for this, that came up. And thank you all so much. Your pictures were amazing because I think the marketing went really well, and it's because of you. But in that, people were separated. There was a huge disparity, and I think that was so interesting. What else can we do before we close out tonight?
I think one of the things that we can do, especially if you're in community and there's some kind of organizational effort, one of the things that we should do is we should have common definitions of what we're talking about and equip people with language. We should also equip people in being able to identify when bias may be at play. We should look at, encourage mindfulness. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Our ability to interrupt our own bias really involves our ability to pause. And if we're not able to pause and be present, you cannot interrupt your own bias because you're not aware. You're sort of just moving automatically. We're making over 35,000 decisions a day. 95% of those are unconscious. And so some of the things that we have to do are things that we don't really want to do because we're not a country that likes to talk about race. And we have to name it. We have to define it. We have to agree to interrupt it for ourselves, but also for others. And I've seen that very effectively. I love it when I work with leaders. And then I see them interrupting bias, their own bias, other people's biases, because they have learned how, and they've learned how to recognize it.
Absolutely.
And so it can be done, but my goodness, does it take practice.
I agree. Yeah. I think bias is learned over time, and we can change our own biases with motivation and intention, being intentional about addressing bias. We can have meaningful relationships with people who are different than us. We can engage in practices that are more mindful. Knowing that you have bias is the first step. You cannot change any type of bias unless you know that it's one that you possess. I'd like to thank you all for joining me. I appreciate you being here for this very important discussion.
Thank you.
As I've said, many people experience some form of bias or privilege, whether it be gender, racial, economic, sexual. Compassion is appreciating the experiences that are outside of your own. One of my favorite American writers is Audre Lorde. And I said this in the marketing. Audre Lorde said, "It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences." So if you get nothing else from here tonight, please take that, because I think it's so important. Once we start recognizing and accepting and celebrating our differences, we'll find that we have more in common than we don't. Thank you all so much for being here. Damali, how can people reach you?
Please reach me at one of my two websites, damalilaw.com, that's DAMALILAW, or breakthroughadr.com. Breakthrough, all one word, and ADR.
Yes. Shouts out to Medhat Seabay from State Farm Insurance, www.medhatseabay.com, or 630-800-2743. Our other sponsors, the Social MVP, socialmvp.com, Scene Chicago, scenechicago.com, Janelle's Bling Things, premierdesigns.com/JanelleG4, Jill Whitwer, my personal stylist, 630-400-8827, Veronica's House of Glamour, 630-995-2320, and Sandy Hernandez for makeup, 630-750-0198. Please join us tomorrow night at 2/9 in Naperville. We've got some exciting news, y'all. Super excited. Thank you for an amazing 80th show. God bless you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.